There was a time when the human body was not protected from hunger, and not protected from cold, but shaped by both at the same time, slowly, continuously, without pause. Not as moments of crisis, but as a condition that did not end. Hunger was not something that arrived and left, but something that stayed, quietly changing how energy was used, how movement was chosen, how long the body could continue before it needed to stop. And cold was not an event, but a constant exchange between the body and the air, the ground, the wind, always present, always taking something away. What is difficult to imagine is not that early humans sometimes felt hungry or cold, but that for long periods of human history, these were not temporary states, but the background of life itself. A body that had to keep moving while losing energy, and had to rest while losing heat. A system that never fully balanced, only adjusted. And if this was not an exception, but the normal condition of being human for thousands of generations, then a different question begins to appear, one that does not have an easy answer. What human life was really like when survival meant enduring hunger and cold. To understand what it meant to live with hunger as a constant condition, it is necessary to move away from the modern idea that hunger comes and goes, that it appears before a meal and disappears afterward, because for most of human history, hunger was not organized around predictable intervals or reliable access to food, but around uncertainty, irregular success, and long stretches where energy intake did not match energy use. And in this state, the body does not simply wait for the next meal, it adjusts continuously, lowering certain functions, shifting how energy is spent, and changing how movement is chosen, so that even small actions begin to carry weight. And this is not a dramatic shift, but a gradual one, where the body remains active but never fully replenished. And in early human environments, where food sources depended on seasons, migration patterns of animals, and the availability of edible plants, there would have been periods where food was sufficient and periods where it was limited. But what matters is not the presence of scarcity alone, but the length of time over which it persisted. Because extended periods of reduced intake do not simply reduce body weight, they influence how the body prioritizes survival. And in such conditions, energy is directed toward essential processes while less immediate functions are reduced. And this redistribution is not something that is consciously experienced, but something that shapes how long a person can move, how far they can travel, and how quickly they need to rest. And when we look at archaeological evidence, we do not see hunger directly, but we see its effects in patterns of movement, in the location of sites that follow seasonal resources, and in the types of tools that suggest repeated attempts to access difficult food sources. And this suggests that early humans were not always starving in the way that sudden famine might be imagined, but were often operating within a narrower margin of energy, where intake and expenditure were rarely in balance for long. And within this narrow margin, the experience of hunger becomes less about acute pain and more about a background condition that shapes every decision, every movement, and every period of rest. And when we return to the starting point of human life in open environments, without stored food, without agriculture, and without predictable supply, the idea of hunger changes from an event into a state that is always present, sometimes stronger, sometimes weaker, but rarely absent. And in that continuous presence, the body learns to function without full recovery, carrying forward a small deficit that is never entirely resolved. And it is within this ongoing imbalance that human life unfolds, not in moments of crisis alone, but in the quiet, persistent adjustment to having slightly less energy than needed, for longer than expected, across generations that began far earlier than any written record. When hunger continues over long periods, the body does not respond with a single reaction but with a series of small adjustments that slowly reshape how energy is used. And these adjustments are not dramatic or easily visible, but operate quietly in the background, changing how long a person can remain active, how quickly fatigue appears, and how often rest becomes necessary. Because without a consistent supply of food, the body cannot maintain the same level of output and must begin to prioritize, directing energy toward processes that are essential for immediate survival, while reducing others that are less urgent. And this process is not a switch but a gradual shift, where each day without sufficient intake slightly alters how the body functions, and over time, this creates a condition in which the body is always operating with a limited reserve never fully restored, and this has direct consequences for movement, because movement requires energy that is no longer abundant, so decisions about when to move, how far to travel, and when to stop become closely tied to the internal state of the body, even if not consciously recognized. And in early human environments, where food was not stored and had to be found, gathered, or hunted, movement could not simply be reduced, because it was the only way to access food. And this creates a tension between the need to conserve energy and the need to spend it. And within this tension, the body must find a way to continue, not by eliminating hunger, but by adapting to it. And archaeological patterns suggest that early humans often moved across landscapes in ways that followed resources rather than remaining in one place, indicating that the search for food was continuous rather than occasional. And this continuous movement under conditions of limited energy implies a form of endurance that is different from modern expectations, not based on short bursts of effort followed by recovery, but on sustained activity with incomplete recovery. And when this pattern extends across long periods, the body does not return to a baseline of fullness, but instead stabilizes at a lower level of available energy, where hunger is no longer an interruption but part of the normal operating condition. And in this state, even rest does not fully restore what has been used, because intake remains uncertain, and this means that each cycle of activity and rest carries forward a small deficit. And when we connect this back to the earliest stages of human life, before agriculture and storage, it becomes clear that the body was shaped not by occasional scarcity, but by repeated exposure to it. And through this repeated exposure, the human body developed ways to continue functioning without complete replenishment, allowing life to persist in environments where food was never guaranteed, but always uncertain and always just enough to continue, but rarely enough to fully recover. As hunger becomes a continuous condition rather than a temporary interruption, it begins to influence not only how the body uses energy, but how movement itself is structured across the day, because every action must exist within the limits of what is available. And this creates a pattern where movement is neither constant nor freely chosen, but shaped by a balance that is never stable, where moving too much risks exhausting limited reserves, and moving too little reduces the chances of finding food. And within this narrow space, decisions about when to move, where to go, and when to stop are not guided by comfort but by necessity, even if that necessity is not consciously calculated. And in early human environments, this would have meant that movement often followed signs of potential resources, such as water sources, seasonal plant growth, or the presence of animals, and these movements would not always lead to immediate success, which means that the energy spent searching could exceed the energy gained, reinforcing the condition of ongoing deficit. And archaeological evidence suggests patterns of repeated movement across landscapes rather than long-term stability in one location, indicating that the search for food was not occasional but continuous. And within this continuity, the body learns to operate under conditions where certainty is absent, and where each movement carries both possibility and risk. And this has implications for how time is experienced, because without predictable access to food, time is not divided into regular intervals of eating and resting, but into periods of searching, waiting, and recovering as much as possible with what is available. And in this structure, hunger is not something that signals the need to eat at a specific moment, but something that remains present regardless of action, shaping the pace and direction of movement over longer spans. And when we connect this to the earliest human contexts, where there was no agriculture, no storage, and no guarantee of the next meal, it becomes clear that movement itself was an extension of hunger, not separate from it but driven by it. And within this relationship, the body and the landscape become closely linked, where the need for energy determines how space is used, and how far a person can travel before the limits of the body require a pause. And even in that pause, the absence of sufficient intake means that recovery is partial, and the next movement begins from a slightly lower point than before, and across time, this repeated cycle does not resolve into balance, but continues as a steady adjustment to living with less than what is needed, where survival is not defined by abundance, but by the ability to continue despite its absence. Cold, like hunger, is often imagined as something that arrives suddenly, a sharp change in temperature that the body reacts to, but in early human environments, cold was more often a continuous exchange rather than an abrupt event, a slow and constant movement of heat from the body into the surrounding air, into the ground, into any surface that was in contact with the skin. And this exchange did not stop, even when the body was at rest, even when there was no wind, even when the temperature did not seem extreme, because the body naturally loses heat to anything that is cooler than itself. And without insulation, without layered clothing, without controlled shelter, this process continues without interruption. And what matters is not only how cold the environment is, but how long the body remains exposed to it, because over time, even a moderate difference in temperature leads to a gradual loss of heat that the body must constantly replace. And replacing that heat requires energy, the same limited energy that is already reduced by the condition of hunger. And this creates a connection between cold and hunger that is not separate but intertwined, because the more heat the body loses, the more energy it must use to maintain internal balance, and in a situation where food intake is uncertain, this additional demand cannot always be met. And when it cannot be met, the body does not immediately fail, but begins to adjust, reducing heat loss where possible, changing circulation, altering how warmth is distributed, and limiting activity that would expose more surface area to the environment. And these adjustments are not choices but responses shaped by the conditions in which early humans lived. And when we look at the environments where early human populations existed, ranging from open savannas to cooler regions where seasonal changes could bring lower temperatures, it becomes clear that cold was not a rare challenge, but a recurring presence, sometimes subtle, sometimes more pronounced, but always part of the background of life. And without consistent fire, without reliable shelter, and without effective clothing, the body existed within this ongoing exchange, never fully separated from it. And this means that rest did not stop heat loss, sleep did not protect against it, and stillness could even increase the rate at which warmth was lost, especially when in contact with the ground. And when we return to the earliest stages of human life, before technological buffers became stable, the experience of cold shifts from something occasional into something continuous, not always intense, but always present, shaping how long the body could remain still, how often it needed to move, and how much energy was required simply to remain within a survivable range. And within this condition, cold is not defined by a single moment of discomfort, but by the slow and persistent reduction of warmth over time, a process that does not demand immediate attention, but gradually reshapes the limits of what the body can sustain. As the body continues to lose heat over time, the demand to replace that lost heat does not stop, and this creates a quiet but constant requirement for energy that exists alongside the already limited supply caused by hunger, so that even when the body is not moving, even when it appears to be resting, it is still working to maintain a stable internal temperature. And this work is not visible, but it shapes how long the body can remain still, how deeply it can rest, and how much energy remains for movement. Because maintaining warmth is not a passive state, it requires continuous metabolic activity, and when food intake is uncertain, the body must draw from its existing reserves to sustain that activity. And over time, this leads to a gradual reduction in available energy, not through sudden loss, but through steady use. And this steady use becomes more significant in environments where temperatures are lower or where the body is exposed to wind, moisture, or contact with colder surfaces, all of which increase the rate of heat loss. And in such conditions, the body is placed in a position where it must balance the need to conserve energy with the need to generate heat. And this balance is never fixed. It shifts depending on the environment, the level of activity, and the current state of the body. And archaeological patterns suggest that early humans often selected locations that offered some natural reduction of heat loss, such as areas protected from wind or surfaces that were less conductive than bare stone, indicating an awareness of how the environment influenced bodily conditions, even if that awareness was not expressed in abstract terms. And yet these environmental choices could only reduce, not eliminate, the continuous loss of heat, because without insulating materials, the body remained in direct exchange with its surroundings. And this means that over long periods, the energy required to maintain warmth could not always be matched by the energy available from food, especially during times of scarcity. And when this mismatch occurs, the body adjusts by lowering activity, slowing movement, and reducing processes that are not immediately necessary. But these adjustments come with limitations, because reducing activity also reduces the ability to generate additional heat through movement, and this creates a cycle in which conserving energy can increase heat loss, and generating heat can accelerate energy depletion. And within this cycle, the body does not find a stable point, but continues to shift between these opposing demands. And when we connect this to the earliest human contexts, where both food and warmth were uncertain, it becomes clear that the experience of cold is not separate from the experience of hunger, but part of the same system, where energy is continuously lost and must be continuously replaced. And when it cannot be fully replaced, the body continues, not in balance, but in a state of ongoing adjustment, carrying forward a deficit that influences how long it can endure. When heat continues to leave the body and energy is not fully restored, the limits of endurance are not reached in a single moment but approached gradually. And this gradual approach changes how the body responds to its surroundings, because instead of reacting to a sudden drop in temperature, it adjusts to a slow decline in available warmth. And within this decline, small differences in the environment begin to matter more, such as whether the ground is dry or damp, whether the air is still or moving, whether the body is exposed or partially shielded. And these differences do not remove the process of heat loss, but they influence its rate, and when the rate changes, even slightly, it can extend or reduce the time the body remains within a survivable range. And this suggests that early human movement across landscapes was not only guided by the search for food, but also by the search for conditions that reduce the ongoing loss of heat. And archaeological evidence supports this through patterns of site selection, where locations often provide some natural advantage, such as proximity to resources combined with features that reduce exposure. And yet these advantages are always partial, because without consistent insulation, the body remains in direct exchange with the environment, and this means that the experience of cold is not eliminated by finding a better location, but only moderated, and within this moderated state, the body can continue for longer, but still within limits that are shaped by both energy availability and environmental conditions. And as these limits are approached, the body does not immediately stop, but reduces its range of action, shortening movements, extending periods of stillness, and relying more on positions that conserve heat. And these responses are not planned in advance, but emerge from the interaction between the body and its surroundings. And when this interaction is repeated across many cycles of activity and rest, it creates a pattern where endurance is not defined by strength or resistance alone, but by the ability to operate within a narrow margin for extended periods. And when we connect this back to the earliest stages of human life, before stable fire use and before reliable clothing, it becomes clear that cold was not something that could be fully avoided, but something that had to be continuously managed. And this management did not create comfort, but allowed continuation. And within that continuation, the body remains in a state where warmth is never fully secured, and energy is never fully restored. And it is in this combined condition that human life unfolds, not as a series of separate challenges, but as a continuous adjustment to losing heat and trying to replace it, again and again, without ever reaching a point where the process ends. When hunger and cold are both present as continuous conditions, the body is not dealing with two separate challenges, but with a single system in which each condition intensifies the other, because the energy that is needed to maintain warmth must come from the same limited supply that is already reduced by lack of food. And at the same time, the cold increases the demand for that energy, creating a situation where the body is being pulled in two directions at once. And this does not create a sudden crisis, but a gradual tension that shapes how long the body can continue before it needs to reduce activity. And within this tension, even simple actions begin to carry a different weight, because every movement uses energy that could otherwise be used to maintain internal temperature. And every period of stillness conserves energy but allows more heat to leave the body, and this means that neither movement nor rest provides a complete solution, and the body must continuously shift between them, not to resolve the tension, but to keep it within a range that allows continuation. And this range is narrow because the margin between having enough energy to maintain warmth and not having enough is not large, especially in environments where food is uncertain and exposure is constant. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans often moved in patterns that balanced access to food with conditions that reduced exposure, indicating that survival depended on managing both hunger and cold together rather than separately. and this combined management does not eliminate either condition, but reduces their impact enough to extend the time the body can function. And when this process repeats across many cycles of movement and rest, it creates a pattern where the body is always adjusting, never fully recovering, and never fully depleted, existing instead in a state that is sustained through continuous balance rather than stable equilibrium. And when we connect this to the earliest human environments, where neither reliable food sources nor consistent protection from the cold were available, it becomes clear that the experience of life was shaped not by isolated challenges, but by the interaction between them. And within that interaction, the body does not solve the problem of hunger or the problem of cold, but carries both at once, adjusting again and again to remain within the limits of what it can endure. Within this combined pressure, the body does not simply lose energy and heat at the same time, it begins to reorganize how both are managed. And this reorganization unfolds gradually as the body attempts to remain within a survivable range, because when energy is limited and heat is continuously lost, the body cannot maintain the same patterns of activity, and instead begins to favor movements that cost less, while still allowing access to resources, and this often results in a slower, more deliberate pace, where unnecessary motion is reduced and necessary motion is extended over time. And this shift is not a conscious strategy, but a consequence of operating under constraint, and it can be seen in how early human movement patterns appear to follow routes that balance resource access with environmental moderation, suggesting that the landscape itself becomes part of how the body manages these pressures. And at the same time, internal processes adjust in ways that are less visible, where heat is conserved in central areas and less is maintained at the surface, and where energy is directed toward maintaining essential functions rather than supporting extended activity. And these adjustments do not eliminate the tension between hunger and cold, but they reshape how it is experienced, spreading its effects across time rather than concentrating them into a single point. And this spreading allows the body to continue for longer, but at a reduced capacity, where endurance is not defined by strength but by the ability to operate under limitation. And when this condition persists, it influences not only individual bodies but also how groups move and organize. Because if each individual is operating within a narrow margin, then group movement must also reflect that margin, favoring routes and rhythms that allow continued function rather than rapid change. And archaeological traces of repeated use of certain paths and locations suggest that early humans did not move randomly, but within patterns shaped by these combined pressures. And within those patterns, the body and the environment form a system where neither can be understood in isolation. And when we return to the earliest stages of human life, before stable fire use and before consistent clothing, it becomes clear that survival was not about overcoming hunger or cold in isolation, but about adjusting to both at once. And in that adjustment, the body does not reach a stable solution, but continues to shift within limits that are always present, always changing, and never fully resolved. As this combined pressure continues across days and seasons, the boundary of what the body can sustain becomes something that is not fixed but constantly approached and adjusted. And this boundary is not marked by a clear line, but by a gradual narrowing of possibilities, where the range of movement, the duration of activity, and the depth of rest all become slightly more limited than before. And within this narrowing, the body does not stop, but reduces, choosing positions that conserve heat, movements that require less energy, and timings that align with environmental conditions that are less demanding. And these choices are not deliberate plans, but responses that emerge from repeated exposure to the same constraints. And over time, this creates a pattern where survival is not defined by a single successful action, but by the ability to remain within this narrowing range without crossing the point where recovery is no longer possible. And archaeological patterns of repeated occupation of certain sites, especially those offering both access to food and some protection from wind or moisture, suggest that early humans were drawn to places that allowed this range to extend slightly, even if only by a small margin. And within that margin, the body could continue for longer, but never without cost, because each cycle of activity and rest still carried forward a deficit, and when this deficit accumulates, the body becomes more dependent on finding moments where both energy intake increases and heat loss decreases, even briefly. And yet such moments would not always be available, which means that the body often continued under conditions where neither requirement was fully met. And in this state, endurance is not a matter of strength alone, but of continuous adjustment, where the body remains active while gradually approaching its limits. And when we connect this to the earliest human environments, where food sources were uncertain and protection from the cold was incomplete, it becomes clear that survival was not achieved by escaping these pressures, but by remaining within them for as long as possible. And within this ongoing state, the body does not find resolution, but maintains a balance that is always temporary, always shifting, and always dependent on the next moment providing just enough to continue. And it is in this continuous adjustment, rather than in any single event, that the experience of enduring hunger and cold is fully understood, not as separate challenges, but as a single condition that shapes how long the body can remain within the limits of life. Movement, under conditions of hunger and cold, is not simply a choice about where to go, but a necessary action that carries a cost every time it happens. Because movement is the only way to reach food, to find water, to change location when conditions become less favorable. And yet each step requires energy that is already limited, and each moment of activity increases heat loss through exposure to air and contact with surfaces, so that movement becomes both a solution and a problem at the same time. And within this tension, the body cannot move freely, but must operate within limits that are defined by how much energy remains and how quickly that energy is being used. And this creates a pattern where movement is often slower, more measured, and extended over time rather than concentrated into short bursts, because sudden, intense activity would deplete available energy too quickly and increase the risk of not being able to continue. And archaeological evidence of long-distance travel routes and repeated use of certain pathways suggest that early humans moved across landscapes in ways that balanced the need to reach resources with the need to conserve energy, and these routes were not necessarily the shortest, but the ones that allowed movement to continue without exhausting the body. And this implies that the landscape itself played a role in shaping movement, where terrain, elevation, and exposure to wind or moisture influenced how much energy was required to move through it. And in environments where the ground was uneven, where vegetation was sparse, or where the climate increased heat loss, movement would have been more costly, and therefore more carefully distributed across time. And when we connect this to the earliest stages of human life, before the development of reliable tools that could significantly reduce effort, it becomes clear that movement was not only a response to the need for food, but also a negotiation with the limits of the body. And within this negotiation, the body does not seek to maximize speed or distance, but to maintain continuity, to keep moving just enough to reach the next resource without crossing the threshold where energy is depleted beyond recovery. And this means that movement is shaped by the same ongoing condition as hunger and cold, not as a separate activity, but as part of the same system where each action must fit within a narrow margin, and where the ability to continue depends not on how fast or how far one can move in a single moment, but on how movement can be sustained over time without fully exhausting what remains. When movement must continue under limited energy and ongoing heat loss, the pace and structure of that movement begin to change in ways that are subtle but consistent, because the body cannot afford to move in the same way it would if energy were abundant, and instead it settles into patterns that reduce strain while still allowing progress. And this often results in a rhythm where effort is spread out, where pauses are shorter but more frequent, and where direction is influenced not only by where resources might be found, but by how demanding the path is. And this creates a form of movement that is closely tied to the landscape, where slight variations in terrain, such as a gradual slope instead of a steep one, or a path sheltered from wind instead of exposed ground, can influence the decision to move in one direction rather than another. And these decisions are not made in isolation, but emerge from repeated interaction between the body and its environment. And over time, they form patterns that can be observed in the archaeological record, where certain routes appear to have been used repeatedly, suggesting that they provided a balance between accessibility and effort. And within these patterns, the body is not maximizing efficiency in a modern sense, but maintaining continuity, choosing paths that allow movement to continue without sudden increases in energy demand. And this is especially important in conditions where hunger reduces the available energy reserve and cold increases the rate at which energy is used. because any sharp increase in effort could push the body closer to its limit. And within this constraint, movement becomes less about reaching a destination quickly and more about ensuring that the body can continue moving at all. And this has implications for how time is experienced, because without a clear endpoint or predictable access to resources, movement is not organized into distinct phases, but flows continuously, shaped by the need to adapt to changing conditions while preserving what remains of the body's energy. And when we connect this back to the earliest human environments, where neither food nor protection was guaranteed, it becomes clear that movement was not simply a means to an end, but a condition of life itself, where the body and the landscape interacted continuously, and where each step was part of an ongoing adjustment to hunger and cold, not as separate challenges, but as forces that shaped how movement could be sustained across time. As movement continues within these constraints, the decision to stop becomes as significant as the decision to move, because stopping does not remove the pressures of hunger and cold, it only shifts how they are experienced. And when the body comes to rest, the immediate demand for energy decreases, but the loss of heat does not stop, and in some conditions, it may even increase, especially when the body is in contact with colder surfaces or exposed to still air that allows heat to dissipate steadily. And this creates a situation where rest provides partial relief from energy expenditure, but increases the need to conserve warmth. And within this trade-off, the body must find positions and locations that reduce heat loss as much as possible, even if only slightly. And this is reflected in patterns where early humans appear to have used natural features such as depressions in the ground, areas shielded from wind, or surfaces that retain some warmth, suggesting that rest was not simply a pause in movement, but an adjustment to the same ongoing conditions. And yet, even in these more favorable locations, the absence of consistent insulation means that rest never fully restores what has been lost, because the body continues to use energy to maintain internal temperature. And when food intake is uncertain, that energy cannot be fully replaced, and this leads to a cycle where movement reduces heat loss through activity, but consumes energy, while rest conserves energy but allows heat to decline, and neither state resolves the underlying tension. And over time, this cycle shapes how long the body can remain active, how deeply it can rest, and how often it must shift between these states. And archaeological traces of repeated use of certain resting sites suggest that early humans were aware, in practical terms, of where these adjustments could be made most effectively, even if those locations did not eliminate exposure. And when we connect this back to the earliest human environments, it becomes clear that rest was not a separate condition from movement, but part of the same system of adaptation, where the body continuously shifts between states in response to hunger and cold, and within this shifting, there is no point at which the body is fully at ease, only moments where the balance is slightly more favorable, and those moments, however brief, allow the body to continue, not because the conditions have changed, but because the body has adjusted to them once again. Rest, in conditions defined by hunger and cold, does not create a clear separation from the environment, but reveals how closely the body remains connected to it, because when movement slows or stops, the processes that were less noticeable during activity become more apparent, and the loss of heat through the skin, through contact with the ground, and through the surrounding air continues without interruption, so that rest does not remove the influence of cold. It allows it to become more steady, more continuous, and often more difficult to offset. And at the same time, the reduction in movement lowers the rate at which energy is used, which might seem to provide relief, but this relief is partial, because the body must still generate enough heat to maintain internal balance, and without sufficient intake of food, the energy required for that process cannot be fully replaced. And this creates a condition where rest becomes a negotiation rather than a recovery, where the body attempts to conserve what remains while still losing heat at a rate that cannot be entirely controlled. And in early human environments, where there was no consistent insulation and no reliable separation between body and ground, the surfaces on which the body rested played a significant role in how quickly heat was lost. And this can be inferred from the repeated use of certain locations that offer even slight advantages, such as dry ground instead of damp soil, or areas protected from wind rather than fully exposed spaces, suggesting that early humans selected resting places not for comfort, but for reduced loss. And yet, even in these more favorable conditions, the absence of clothing and constructed shelter meant that the body remained in direct exchange with its surroundings. And this exchange did not stop during sleep, which implies that sleep itself occurred within the same ongoing conditions of energy limitation and heat loss. And when we consider the earlier stages of human life, before the widespread use of fire or the development of insulating materials, it becomes clear that rest did not provide a full reset, but only a partial pause within a continuous process where the body never fully regained what had been lost, and instead carried forward a small deficit into the next cycle of movement. And within this pattern, rest is not defined by comfort or completeness, but by the ability to reduce loss enough to continue, and it is within this limited form of recovery that the body maintains its capacity to move again, not because the conditions have improved, but because the body has adjusted once more to remain within them. As rest continues under these conditions, the body does not enter a state of full recovery, but settles into a lighter form of restoration, where certain processes slow while others remain active. And this creates a pattern in which sleep, if it occurs, is shaped by the same constraints as waking activity, because the body must still regulate temperature, still lose heat to the environment, and still function with limited available energy. And this means that rest is not defined by complete stillness or uninterrupted duration, but by intervals that are influenced by changes in the environment, such as shifts in temperature, movement of air, or contact with colder surfaces, all of which can alter how quickly heat is lost and how much energy is required to maintain internal balance. And in early human contexts, where there was no consistent insulation and no controlled indoor space, these environmental variations would have directly influenced how rest was experienced, leading to patterns that were likely shorter, more fragmented, and closely tied to external conditions rather than internal schedules. And archaeological evidence does not preserve sleep directly, but the repeated use of certain sheltered locations, such as areas near rock formations or natural depressions, suggests that early humans sought places where these environmental effects could be slightly reduced, even if they could not be eliminated. And within these locations, the body could maintain warmth for longer periods, allowing rest to extend beyond what would be possible in fully exposed conditions. And yet, even in these more favorable settings, the absence of sufficient energy intake means that the processes required for recovery could not operate at full capacity, and this creates a situation where rest contributes to continuation but does not restore the body to a complete baseline. And when this pattern is repeated over many cycles, it leads to a form of endurance where the body remains functional despite incomplete recovery, carrying forward small deficits that influence how it responds to the next period of activity. And when we connect this back to the earliest human environments, it becomes clear that rest was not a separate phase of life distinct from movement, but part of a continuous system in which the body adjusts to hunger and cold in both states. And within this system, the distinction between activity and rest becomes less defined, because both are shaped by the same underlying conditions, and both contribute to a form of survival that depends not on full recovery, but on the ability to continue with less than what is needed, again and again across time. Over many cycles of activity and rest, the body begins to carry forward a pattern where no single period fully restores what has been lost, and this accumulation is not sudden or easily visible, but gradual, shaping how the body responds to each new moment, because when rest does not fully recover energy and does not fully preserve warmth, the next period of movement begins from a slightly reduced point, and this reduction influences how long the body can remain active, how quickly fatigue appears, and how much heat can be maintained without additional energy. And within this pattern, the body does not collapse, but continues, adjusting its range of action to fit within what remains available, and this creates a form of endurance that is different from modern expectations, not based on cycles of depletion followed by full recovery, but on continuous operation within a limited margin, where each cycle overlaps with the next without clear separation, and archaeological traces of repeated use of certain locations, combined with patterns of movement across landscapes, suggest that early humans operated within this ongoing condition, returning to places that offered slight advantages while continuing to move when those advantages were no longer sufficient. And within this movement and return, the body carries its previous state forward, not as a complete reset, but as a continuation, And when this process extends across longer periods, it influences not only individual endurance but also the rhythm of group activity. Because if each individual is operating under incomplete recovery, then the group as a whole must move and rest within limits that reflect that condition. And this can be seen in the spacing of sites and the distribution of resources, where movement appears to be paced in a way that allows continuation rather than rapid transition. And when we connect this back to the earliest human environments, before reliable fire, before consistent shelter, and before insulating clothing, it becomes clear that rest was not a state of comfort or restoration, but a necessary adjustment within an ongoing process, where the body maintains itself not by fully recovering, but by repeatedly adapting to having less than what it needs. And within this repeated adaptation, the distinction between loss and recovery becomes less clear, because both are occurring at the same time, and survival depends not on eliminating loss, but on keeping it within a range that allows the next moment to begin, even if that moment starts with slightly less than before. In environments where hunger and cold are continuous, the surrounding world cannot be understood as a passive background, because it actively shapes how the body loses energy and heat at every moment. And this means that landscape is not simply where life happens, but part of how life is sustained or limited. And small differences in terrain, in exposure, and in available cover begin to matter in ways that are not immediately visible, because a slight change in elevation can alter wind patterns. A shift in ground composition can influence how quickly heat is drawn away from the body, and the presence or absence of natural barriers can determine how much of the body is exposed to moving air. And these factors do not remove the underlying conditions of hunger and cold, but they influence how quickly those conditions intensify. And when the rate of heat loss or energy use changes, even slightly, it can extend the time the body remains within a survivable range. And this suggests that early humans were not only moving in response to the availability of food, but also in response to the physical characteristics of the environment that affected how the body functioned. And archaeological patterns support this through the repeated use of locations that combine access to resources with some degree of environmental moderation, such as areas that provide partial shelter from wind or surfaces that are less conductive than exposed stone. And these locations do not offer comfort in a modern sense, but they provide a small reduction in the rate at which the body loses heat or expends energy. And within this reduction, the body can continue for longer, even if the overall condition remains unchanged. And when we consider the earlier stages of human life, before stable structures and before consistent insulation, it becomes clear that the environment itself functioned as the primary interface between the body and the conditions of hunger and cold. And within this interface, the body does not exist separately from the landscape, but as part of a system where each influences the other. And this relationship is continuous, not occasional, because the body is always in contact with the ground, always exposed to air, and always dependent on what the environment provides or limits. And within this ongoing interaction, survival is not achieved by escaping the environment, but by moving within it in ways that reduce its impact just enough to continue. And it is in this constant adjustment between body and landscape that the experience of enduring hunger and cold becomes fully shaped, not as isolated pressures, but as conditions that are expressed through the physical world itself. Within this continuous interaction, the body does not encounter the environment as a single uniform condition, but as a series of small variations that change across space and time. And these variations, though subtle, can influence how quickly energy is used and how rapidly heat is lost. Because a patch of ground that retains moisture will draw heat differently than one that is dry. A slight shelter from wind can slow the movement of air across the skin, and a shift in elevation can alter both temperature and exposure. And while none of these differences eliminate the underlying pressures of hunger and cold, they create a landscape that is uneven in its effects, where certain locations allow the body to continue for longer, and others shorten the time before limits are reached. And archaeological evidence suggests that early humans moved within this uneven landscape in ways that reflect an awareness of these differences, returning to areas that provided relative advantage while leaving those that increased strain. And this pattern of return and movement indicates that the environment was read not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of how it affected the body's ongoing balance. And within this reading, the body becomes a measure of the environment, responding to small changes in heat loss and energy demand without the need for abstract understanding. And over time, this creates a form of adaptation that is expressed through movement and location choice, rather than through permanent alteration of the environment itself. And when we consider the earliest human contexts, before the development of stable shelter or consistent insulation, it becomes clear that survival depended on moving through these variations in a way that extended endurance, not by finding a place free of hunger and cold, but by remaining in places where their effects were slightly reduced. And within this process, the environment is not controlled, but navigated, and the body does not overcome it, but adjusts to it continuously. And it is through this ongoing adjustment that life persists, not in a single favourable condition, but across a shifting landscape where each small difference contributes to how long the body can continue within the limits imposed by hunger and cold. As these small variations are encountered again and again, they begin to form patterns that shape how space is used over longer periods. And these patterns are not fixed routes or permanent settlements, but shifting paths that follow the changing balance between resource availability and environmental pressure. Because the same location that offers reduced heat loss at one time may become less favourable as conditions change, and this requires continuous adjustment, where movement is guided not only by the search for food, but by the need to remain within a range, where energy and heat can be sustained, and archaeological traces of repeated occupation, combined with evidence of movement between sites, suggest that early humans operated within these patterns, returning to certain locations when conditions allowed and leaving them when the balance shifted. And within this process, the landscape is not divided into safe and unsafe areas, but into places that extend endurance and places that reduce it. And this distinction is always temporary, because environmental conditions do not remain constant, and the body must respond to each change as it occurs. And when this interaction continues across generations, it creates a relationship between humans and their environment that is based on adaptation rather than control, where the body does not reshape the landscape in a lasting way, but moves within it in response to its changing conditions, and this movement is not random, but structured by the need to manage the combined effects of hunger and cold. And when we connect this back to the earliest stages of human life, before the development of stable shelter, controlled fire, and effective clothing, it becomes clear that the environment itself functioned as both a constraint and a guide, shaping how life could continue. And within this relationship, survival is not achieved by escaping environmental pressure, but by remaining within a shifting balance where that pressure is reduced just enough to allow continuation. And it is in this ongoing negotiation between body and landscape that the experience of enduring hunger and cold is sustained, not as isolated events, but as conditions that are continuously expressed through the physical world and the ways in which the body moves through it. The experience of hunger and cold does not remain only within the body or the immediate environment. It leaves traces that can be observed indirectly through the material record, because while the sensations themselves do not preserve, the patterns they create in movement, location, and behavior can be studied, and this requires a shift in perspective, from looking for direct evidence of discomfort to recognizing the outcomes of long-term adaptation. And in early human contexts, these outcomes appear in the distribution of sites across landscapes, where certain areas show repeated use while others remain less occupied, suggesting that some locations offered conditions that allowed the body to endure for longer periods. And these locations often combine access to food resources with environmental features that reduce exposure, such as natural windbreaks, elevated ground that avoids dampness, or proximity to materials that can support fire. And while none of these features eliminate hunger or cold, they influence how those conditions are experienced. And over time, this influence becomes visible in the archaeological record as a preference for certain types of environments. And this preference does not indicate comfort, but relative advantage, where the balance between energy intake and heat loss is slightly more favourable. And beyond location, the types of tools found at these sites also provide indirect evidence, because tools related to processing food, such as cutting implements, or evidence of repeated use of fire in later periods, suggest ongoing attempts to increase the efficiency of energy intake, while the presence of materials that could be used for covering or insulation, even in simple forms, indicates a gradual response to the pressure of heat loss. And these developments do not appear suddenly, but emerge over long periods, reflecting a continuous process of adjustment rather than a single solution. And when we connect these traces back to the earliest stages of human life, before these adaptations became more stable, it becomes clear that the absence of such evidence in earlier contexts suggests a greater reliance on movement and environmental selection alone. And this reinforces the idea that hunger and cold were not occasional challenges, but conditions that shape behavior at every level. And within this framework, the archaeological record becomes a way of observing how those conditions were managed, not by eliminating them, but by responding to their effects through changes in how space was used, how tools were developed, and how life was organized across time. Because the direct experience of hunger and cold does not leave clear physical traces, understanding their role depends on reading patterns that repeat across different sites and time periods, and these patterns often appear in the way materials are used, modified, and left behind, suggesting ongoing efforts to manage energy and heat even when complete solutions were not yet available. And one of the most consistent indications comes from evidence of food processing, where marks on bones, the presence of stone tools designed for cutting, and the gradual increase in efficiency of these tools point to a sustained effort to extract as much usable energy as possible from available resources. And this does not eliminate hunger, but reduces its intensity enough to extend endurance. And similarly, the controlled use of fire, where it appears, provides a way to reduce heat loss and improve the digestibility of food. And although its use was not always consistent in the earliest periods, its repeated appearance suggests that managing warmth and energy became increasingly important over time. And alongside these developments, there are indications of simple coverings, such as the use of animal skins, which do not provide the same level of insulation as later clothing, but still represent an attempt to reduce direct exposure. And these coverings are rarely preserved directly, but their use can be inferred from associated tools and patterns of resource use. And what is important is not the presence of a complete system, but the gradual emergence of multiple partial solutions, each addressing a small part of the ongoing pressure created by hunger and cold. And when these partial solutions are viewed together, they form a picture of adaptation that is continuous rather than sudden, where each change builds on previous adjustments without fully resolving the underlying conditions. And when we connect this to the earliest human contexts, where such tools and practices were less developed or absent, it becomes clear that earlier populations relied more heavily on movement and environmental selection, and that the later appearance of these material traces reflects a shift toward modifying the relationship between body and environment, even if that modification remained incomplete. And within this gradual shift, the archaeological record allows us to see how the pressures of hunger and cold were not only endured, but increasingly managed through changes in behavior and material use, shaping the long-term development of human life. When these material traces are considered across longer spans of time, they begin to reveal not only isolated responses but a broader shift in how human populations were distributed and how they moved through different environments. Because the pressures of hunger and cold did not affect all regions in the same way, and this variation influenced where people could remain for longer periods and where they had to move more frequently. And archaeological patterns show that some areas were used repeatedly across generations, while others appear only briefly or intermittently, suggesting that certain environments offered conditions that allowed a more stable balance between energy intake and heat loss, even if that balance was never complete. And this distribution is not random, but reflects the combined influence of resource availability, climate, and terrain. And when populations moved into regions with colder conditions or less predictable food sources, the need for additional forms of adaptation became more apparent, which is reflected in the gradual increase in evidence for fire use, more efficient tools, and eventually more consistent use of coverings. And these changes do not appear simultaneously, but emerge over time as responses to specific environmental pressures. And within this process, the limits of where humans could live are not fixed, but expand and contract depending on the effectiveness of these adaptations. And when we look at earlier periods, where such adaptations were less developed, the range of environments that could support sustained human presence appears more limited, suggesting that hunger and cold played a role in defining those boundaries. And as new methods of managing these pressures became available, those boundaries shifted, allowing populations to remain in areas that would have previously been difficult to sustain. And this does not mean that the pressures disappeared, but that they were moderated enough to extend endurance. And when we connect this back to the earliest human experience, it becomes clear that the archaeological record does not show a sudden transition from vulnerability to control, but a gradual process in which hunger and cold continued to shape where and how life could persist. And within this process, each trace, whether it is a tool, a hearth, or a pattern of site use, becomes part of a larger picture of continuous adjustment, where survival is defined not by the removal of environmental pressure, but by the ability to remain within it for longer periods, across changing landscapes and over extended time. Over time, the continuous pressure of hunger and cold did not disappear, but the ways of responding to them began to change, slowly and unevenly, as certain practices and materials started to alter the direct relationship between the body and the environment. And among these changes, the controlled use of fire stands out as one of the earliest forms of modifying that relationship, because fire does not remove the cold entirely, but creates a localized area where heat loss is reduced and the body can remain within a more stable range for longer periods. And this stability is not permanent, it exists only while the fire is maintained, and only within a limited space. But even this limited effect represents a shift, because it allows rest to occur under conditions that are slightly less demanding, and it reduces the amount of energy the body must use to maintain internal temperature. And at the same time, fire influences how food is processed, making certain foods easier to consume and increasing the efficiency of energy intake, which in turn affects how the body responds to hunger. And yet these effects are not immediate or complete, because early use of fire was not always consistent, and its availability depended on both natural conditions and the ability to maintain it. And alongside fire, the use of natural shelters, such as caves, rock overhangs, or areas protected by terrain, begins to play a more consistent role, not as constructed environments, but as selected spaces that reduce exposure to wind, moisture, and temperature variation. And these shelters do not create isolation from the environment, but they modify it enough to extend endurance. And in combination, these elements begin to form a pattern where the body is no longer fully exposed at all times, but instead moves between states of greater and lesser exposure, depending on location and conditions. And when we look at archaeological evidence, we see increasing signs of repeated use of such locations, suggesting that they provided a relative advantage that was recognized through experience. And when we connect this to the earlier state of continuous exposure, it becomes clear that these developments do not represent a complete solution to hunger and cold, but rather a gradual layering of partial protections, each reducing the impact of environmental pressure without eliminating it. And within this gradual shift, the experience of survival begins to change, not because the underlying conditions are removed, but because the body gains moments where the balance between energy and heat is slightly more favorable, and those moments, though limited, allow life to continue with less immediate strain, extending the range of what can be endured. As these partial protections became more consistent, another gradual change began to appear in the form of coverings that reduced direct exposure of the body. And although early forms of clothing were simple and not comparable to later developments, their presence marked a shift in how the body interacted with the environment, because even a basic covering, such as animal skin placed over part of the body, can slow the loss of heat and reduce the immediate impact of wind and contact with surfaces. And this slowing does not stop the process of heat exchange, but it changes its rate, allowing the body to retain warmth for longer periods and reducing the amount of energy required to maintain internal balance. And this effect becomes especially important when combined with limited energy intake, because any reduction in heat loss helps preserve what little energy is available, and archaeological evidence for early clothing is indirect, often inferred from tools used to process animal hides and from the expansion of human populations into colder regions where some form of covering would have been necessary. And this suggests that the use of such coverings developed gradually as a response to environmental pressure, rather than as a sudden invention. And within this development, the body begins to experience moments where it is less directly exposed, not completely separated from the environment, but partially buffered from it. And this buffering changes how long the body can remain still, how far it can move without losing excessive heat, and how it responds to variations in temperature and wind. And when we connect this to the earlier state of continuous exposure, it becomes clear that the introduction of coverings does not eliminate hunger or cold, but shifts the balance between them, making it slightly easier to conserve energy while maintaining warmth. And this shift, though small, has broader implications because it extends the range of environments in which humans can remain for longer periods, and it allows for a more stable rhythm of movement and rest, even if that stability is still limited. And within this gradual process, the relationship between body and environment becomes more mediated, not fully controlled, but increasingly influenced by the materials and practices that humans develop. And it is through this accumulation of small changes that the conditions of survival begin to transform, not by removing the pressures of hunger and cold, but by altering how they are experienced over time. As fire, shelter, and early coverings begin to appear together, their effects do not combine into a complete solution, but into a layered system where each element reduces a different part of the ongoing pressure, and this layering changes the rhythm of daily life in ways that are gradual rather than immediate, because the body is no longer fully exposed at every moment, but moves between states of greater and lesser protection depending on what is available, and this creates intervals where heat loss slows, where energy is conserved more effectively, and where rest can extend slightly beyond what was previously possible. And yet these intervals remain limited, because fire must be maintained, shelter must be found or reached, and coverings must be acquired and carried. And none of these conditions are guaranteed at all times, which means that the body still returns repeatedly to states of exposure, and within this alternating pattern, survival becomes a sequence of partial relief rather than continuous protection, and archaeological evidence of repeated use of hearths, increased complexity in tool use, and wider distribution of populations into varied environments suggests that these layered adaptations allowed humans to extend their presence across landscapes that would have previously been more difficult to sustain. And this extension does not remove the underlying conditions of hunger and cold, but moderates them enough to allow longer periods of activity and more consistent patterns of rest. And when we connect this to the earliest human experience, it becomes clear that the shift is not from vulnerability to security, but from continuous exposure to intermittent protection, where the body still operates within limits but has access to moments where those limits are less restrictive. And within these moments, the body can preserve more energy, retain more heat, and continue with slightly less strain. And over time, the accumulation of these moments changes how life is organized, not by eliminating the need to endure, but by creating conditions where endurance is supported in small, repeated ways. And it is through this gradual accumulation that the experience of survival evolves, not into a state of comfort, but into a more sustained form of continuation, where hunger and cold remain present, but are no longer unbroken in their effect. Even as these layers of protection begin to appear, the body that carries them forward is not entirely changed, because the human body that exists in the present still reflects a long history of adapting to conditions where hunger and cold were constant. And this reflection can be seen in how the body responds to energy shortage, how it regulates temperature, and how it adjusts activity when limits are approached. And these responses do not originate in modern environments, but in earlier conditions where survival depended on managing imbalance rather than eliminating it. And when the body encounters cold, it still shifts circulation, still prioritizes internal stability over external comfort. And when food intake is reduced, it still adjusts how energy is used, conserving where possible and reducing processes that are not immediately necessary. And these responses suggest that the body retains patterns that were shaped over long periods of exposure, even if the conditions that created them are no longer constant. And this continuity creates a connection between past and present that is not always visible, because modern life often separates the body from direct exposure through stable shelter, consistent food supply, and insulating materials, and yet the underlying systems remain, responding in ways that reflect earlier conditions. And when we consider this connection, it becomes possible to understand that the experience of hunger and cold was not only a challenge that early humans endured, but a shaping force that influenced how the body functions today. And this influence does not imply that the body is unchanged, but that it carries forward certain responses that were necessary for survival in environments where balance was rarely achieved. And when we connect this to the earlier state of continuous adjustment, it becomes clear that the body is not designed for a single stable condition, but for variability, for operating within ranges that shift depending on what is available, and this capacity for adjustment is what allowed life to continue under pressure, not by removing the pressure, but by responding to it in ways that extend endurance. And within this perspective, the modern body can be seen as part of a longer process, one that began in conditions where hunger and cold were not temporary, but ongoing, and where survival depended on the ability to remain within those conditions without reaching the point where continuation was no longer possible. As the present body carries these older patterns, the environments it now lives within often reduce the need to use them continuously, and this reduction creates a distance between the conditions that shaped the body and the conditions it now experiences, because stable shelter limits exposure to cold, consistent access to food, reduces prolonged energy deficit, and controlled environments allow the body to remain within narrower ranges of temperature and activity, and yet this distance does not remove the underlying systems. It only changes how often they are activated, and when those systems are engaged, even briefly, they reveal the same patterns of adjustment that were necessary in earlier contexts, where the body reduces activity under limited energy, conserves heat through internal regulation, and shifts its responses to remain within survivable limits. And this suggests that the capacity to endure hunger and cold is not something that belongs only to the past, but remains part of the body's potential, even if it is rarely required in the same continuous way. And when we consider this, it becomes possible to see modern conditions not as a complete departure from earlier human life, but as a variation in which the pressures of hunger and cold are moderated rather than removed, and this moderation allows for new forms of stability, but it also means that the experience of continuous adjustment is less visible, because the body is not required to operate at the edge of its limits for extended periods. And when we connect this back to the earlier state of life, where such limits were approached repeatedly, it becomes clear that the difference is not in the nature of the body, but in the frequency and intensity of the conditions it encounters, and within this difference, the body retains the ability to respond in ways that were shaped over long periods of exposure, even if those responses are now less often needed. And this continuity suggests that the history of enduring hunger and cold is not entirely separate from the present, but remains embedded within the way the body functions, quietly, beneath the conditions that now make those pressures less constant. And in this sense, the past is not distant, but carried forward in the responses that remain, even when they are not always required. When the long continuity between past and present is considered, the question of what human life was really like under conditions of hunger and cold does not lead to a single answer, but to a recognition that life was shaped by ongoing adjustment rather than stable balance, and this adjustment did not remove the pressures that were present, but allowed the body to remain within them without reaching a final limit. And across time, this created a pattern where survival was not defined by comfort or certainty, but by the ability to continue within a narrow range where energy and heat were never fully secure. And when we reflect on this, it becomes possible to see that the development of fire, shelter, and clothing did not erase the earlier condition, but gradually changed how often the body was exposed to it. And even now, when those protections are widely available, the underlying systems that respond to hunger and cold remain, suggesting that the body still carries the capacity to adjust in ways that were once necessary for survival. And this does not mean that the past can be fully experienced again, but that its influence persists in how the body responds when conditions change. And within this perspective, the distinction between past and present becomes less absolute, because the same processes that once operated continuously now exist in a moderated form. And when we consider the long span of human life before stable protection, it becomes clear that what was once constant is now intermittent, and what was once unavoidable is now often prevented. And yet the memory of those conditions is not held in conscious awareness, but in the structure of the body itself, in how it manages energy, how it regulates temperature, and how it adjusts when limits are approached. And as this understanding settles, the original question remains open, not because it cannot be answered, but because it does not resolve into a single image, but into a continuous process, one that unfolds across time, where the body remains within changing conditions, always adjusting, never fully separate from the world around it. And within that process, the meaning of enduring hunger and cold is not fixed, but extends into the present, quietly shaping how life continues, even when those pressures are no longer constant. And so the question does not end with a conclusion, but returns again in a different form, asking not only what life was like, but how much of that life still remains within the body today, and how it would respond if the balance that now exists were to shift once more.